My fellow Americans, we find ourselves once again at a crossroads, a moment when the actions of our leadership demand not merely our attention, but our careful reflection and our unwavering commitment to the principles that have long guided this nation through turbulent waters. The announcement by President Trump that the United States would effectively close the airspace above and around Venezuela represents more than a policy decision. It represents a fundamental challenge to the architecture of international law, a test of our commitment to diplomatic resolution, and a question about what kind of nation we aspire to be in an increasingly interconnected world. The stakes could not be higher. And so, with the gravity this moment deserves, let us examine what has transpired, what it means, and what it reveals about the path we are choosing to walk. Now, let's be clear about what we're discussing here.
President Trump issued a unilateral statement declaring that all air traffic, both commercial and illicit, should consider the airspace above Venezuela closed in its entirety. This was not a formal declaration
passed through international bodies. This was not the result of multilateral negotiations or United Nations Security Council resolutions. This was a pronouncement from one nation's executive claiming the authority to render impassable the sovereign airspace of another nation. The official justification centers on a worsening security situation and a documented surge in drug trafficking emanating from Venezuelan territory. And let us acknowledge forthrightly, Venezuela is indeed facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. The regime of Nicolas Maduro has presided over economic collapse, the exodus of millions of refugees, the deterioration of democratic institutions, and the proliferation of criminal networks. The drug trafficking concerns are not manufactured. The security implications are real. The suffering of the Venezuelan people is undeniable. But, and this is the crucial distinction we must make, the existence of a genuine problem does not automatically legitimate any and every response to that problem. The ends do not always justify the means. The question before us is not whether Venezuela presents challenges that demand attention. The question is whether this particular action represents a wise, lawful, and effective response to those challenges. The relationship between the United States and Venezuela has been fraught for decades, marked by ideological divergence, economic interests in Venezuelan oil resources, and competing visions of regional influence. For years, successive American administrations have employed economic sanctions designed to pressure the Maduro government toward democratic reform, sanctions that critics argue have inflicted collective punishment on ordinary Venezuelans while failing to dislodge Maduro from power. The truth is this: Venezuela represents one of the most complex foreign policy challenges of our era. It is a nation rich in natural resources, yet impoverished by mismanagement and corruption. It is a people yearning for democracy, yet trapped under authoritarian rule. It is a regional crisis with global implications, touching on migration, energy security, drug trafficking, and the future of democratic governance in Latin America. And now, President Trump has chosen to add a new dimension to this crisis, one that raises profound questions about international law, American authority, and the precedents we are willing to establish. The principle of sovereignty over national airspace is not some arcane technical matter. It is one of the foundational pillars of the modern international system. Since the 1944 Chicago Convention, the international community has recognized that every nation possesses complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. This principle exists to establish predictability, safety, and mutual respect in a world where thousands of aircraft cross borders every single day. When we examine what President Trump has actually claimed the authority to do, we confront an uncomfortable reality. Under established international law, the United States does not possess the legal authority to unilaterally close another sovereign nation's airspace. That authority rests with the government of Venezuela, however much we may dispute the legitimacy of that government's claim to power. Let me be unambiguous about the concerns this action raises, for they strike at the very heart of the international order we have worked for generations to build and maintain. First, the violation of international law and the erosion of sovereignty. We cannot underestimate the significance of one nation claiming the unilateral authority to close another nation's airspace. This is a fundamental breach of the principle of territorial sovereignty that undergirds the entire framework of international relations. Consider the precedent being established. If the United States can declare Venezuelan airspace closed because we object to its government's policies or criminal activity within its borders, then what prevents Russia from claiming the authority to close Ukrainian airspace? What prevents China from declaring the airspace above Taiwan off limits? What prevents any powerful nation from substituting its own judgment for the sovereign rights of smaller, weaker states? The answer to these questions shapes the kind of world our children will inherit. And the answer is being written in real time through actions like this one. The international legal order, imperfect though it may be, exists precisely to constrain the ability of powerful nations to impose their will through unilateral action. When we erode these norms, we weaken the very system that has helped prevent great power conflict for nearly 8 decades. Some will argue that Maduro's regime has forfeited its right to sovereignty through its own violations of international law and human rights. But the problem with abandoning the principle of sovereignty when it becomes inconvenient is that we create a world where might determines right, where power substitutes for law, and where the strong do as they will while the weak suffer what they must. Is that the world we want to build? I would submit that it is not because we harbor illusions about the nature of the Maduro regime, but because we understand that the alternative to a rules-based international order is not freedom and justice, but chaos and the dominance of raw power. Second, the risk of international escalation and military confrontation. Let me be clear. Actions of this magnitude do not occur in a vacuum. They generate responses. They create dynamics that can spiral beyond control. When the United States declares Venezuelan airspace closed and backs that declaration with the implicit threat of enforcement, we enter dangerous territory. How will such a closure be enforced? With what level of force? And what happens when that enforcement is tested? Consider a commercial airliner carrying passengers from Europe to South America, filing a flight plan through Venezuelan airspace. Does the United States now claim the authority to intercept that aircraft, to force it to divert, and if so, under what legal framework? Or consider Venezuelan military aircraft continuing to operate within what they reasonably consider their own sovereign airspace? Does the United States now claim the right to engage Venezuelan military assets within Venezuelan territory? Would such action not constitute an act of war? These are not abstract hypothetical scenarios. These are practical questions that flow inevitably from this policy. And the answers carry the potential for catastrophic escalation. Venezuela maintains close relationships with Russia, which has provided military equipment and support. It maintains ties with China, which has significant economic investments in Venezuelan oil. It maintains alliances with Cuba, Iran, and other nations that view American intervention with deep suspicion. An action that begins as pressure on the Maduro regime could easily escalate into a broader regional or even global confrontation. Miscalculation, that ever-present danger in international relations, could lead us down a path from which there is no easy return. The history of American foreign policy is replete with examples of actions that seemed decisive in the moment but led to consequences far exceeding initial intentions. History teaches us to be humble about our ability to control events once we set them in motion. Third, the humanitarian and economic impact on the Venezuelan people. Here we must confront a painful irony. The stated purpose of this action is to address the crisis in Venezuela, to combat drug trafficking, to pressure the Maduro regime, and yet the likely effect is to inflict additional suffering on the very people we claim to be helping. Venezuela is already experiencing a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions have fled. Those who remain face shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities. The healthcare system has collapsed. The economy has contracted by more than half. And now we propose to further isolate this suffering population by cutting off a critical artery of connection to the outside world. Commercial air traffic serves essential functions in times of crisis. It enables the delivery of humanitarian supplies. It provides an escape route for those fleeing persecution or seeking medical treatment. It maintains family connections across borders. It represents a lifeline for millions of ordinary people who bear no responsibility for the failures of their government. When we close that airspace, we do not primarily harm Nicolas Maduro or his inner circle. We do not materially affect the drug traffickers, who have proven endlessly resourceful in finding alternative routes. We harm, instead, the grandmother trying to reach her family in Colombia, the cancer patient seeking treatment abroad, the relief worker attempting to deliver supplies, the journalist trying to report on conditions inside the country. This is collective punishment, masquerading as targeted pressure. This is a blunt instrument applied to a problem that demands surgical precision. And we must ask ourselves, what does this say about our values? When we claim to stand for freedom and human rights, and then pursue policies that compound the suffering of the vulnerable, do we not undermine the very principles we profess to uphold? Fourth, the constitutional and procedural concerns. Finally, let us address the domestic implications, the questions this raises about presidential authority, congressional oversight, and the constitutional order that governs the exercise of American power. The president does indeed possess broad authority in matters of foreign policy and national security, but this authority is not unlimited. It exists within a framework of constitutional constraints and congressional prerogatives that the founders designed specifically to prevent the concentration of war-making power in a single individual. When President Trump announced the closure of Venezuelan airspace, he did so without a declaration of war from Congress, without authorization for the use of military force, and without clear statutory authority for such an unprecedented action. He did so through unilateral executive pronouncement, a concerning pattern that has characterized much of his approach to foreign policy. The decision to effectively blockade another nation, to threaten the use of force to enforce that blockade, to risk military confrontation with a foreign government and potentially with its allies. These are decisions of the greatest magnitude. These are decisions that the Constitution envisions being made through deliberation, debate, and the democratic process. The bypassing of diplomatic channels is equally concerning. The United States is part of a vast network of international institutions designed to address precisely the sorts of challenges posed by Venezuela. We are members of the Organization of American States. We participate in the United Nations. We have diplomatic channels through which pressure can be applied and collective action can be organized. These multilateral mechanisms may be slower than unilateral action. They may be frustrating in their complexity, but they exist for a reason, to ensure that major decisions affecting international peace and security are not made rashly, in isolation, and without the legitimacy that comes from collective deliberation. When we abandon these diplomatic channels, we weaken the very institutions that amplify American influence. We signal to our allies that their input is irrelevant. We strengthen the hand of those who argue that the international system is merely a facade for American hegemony rather than a framework for genuine cooperation. My fellow Americans, we stand at a moment of choice. We stand at a moment when the decisions we make will shape the trajectory of American foreign policy and the future of the international order for years to come. We can choose the path of unilateral assertion, of might makes right, of expedient action unconstrained by law or alliance. Or we can choose the path of principled leadership, of multilateral cooperation, of patience and persistence in the pursuit of just and lasting solutions. We can choose to abandon the norms and institutions that have prevented great power war for nearly 8 decades. Or we can choose to strengthen and reform those institutions, recognizing that our long-term security depends on a stable, rules-based international order. We can choose policies that inflict collective punishment on vulnerable populations. Or we can choose approaches that target those truly responsible for wrongdoing while offering solidarity to those who suffer under authoritarian rule. We can choose to concentrate unchecked power in the hands of the executive branch. Or we can choose to insist on the constitutional processes, the congressional oversight, the democratic accountability that our founders envisioned as essential safeguards. These choices matter, These choices will define us. These choices will determine whether we rise to meet this moment with the wisdom, the courage, and the moral clarity that the American people have demonstrated in our finest hours. And so I say to you, let us choose hope over fear. Let us choose cooperation over confrontation. Let us choose the patient work of diplomacy over the immediate gratification of unilateral force. Let us choose to hold fast to our principles even when they prove inconvenient. Let us choose to be a nation that leads not through the assertion of raw power, but through the persuasive force of our example and the clarity of our values. The crisis in Venezuela demands our attention, our engagement, and yes, our action. But let that action be grounded in international law, pursued through diplomatic channels, coordinated with our allies, and designed to alleviate suffering rather than compound it. Let that action reflect the best of who we are as Americans, our commitment to human dignity, our respect for sovereignty and self-determination, our belief in the possibility of change through peaceful means. This is the harder path. This is the more demanding path, but it is the right path. And if we dare to walk it together, we will look back on this moment not with regret, but with pride that when we were tested, we chose to be guided not by the exigency of the moment, but by the enduring truth of our values. Thank you. God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America.